In the holler, there are 3 ways to speak without making a sound. You watch the way a quilt hangs, you look at the angle of a broom, and you listen for the bird that doesn't belong in the trees. Now, most folks today, they got their phones and their texting and their instant everything. But back in the deep mountains, back when the hollers were separated by ridges so steep a man could walk all day and never see another soul, people still needed to talk. They needed to warn each other. They needed to guide friends through the darkness. They needed to tell secrets that the law couldn't hear, that strangers couldn't understand, and that the mountains themselves would keep. Welcome back to Legends from the Holler. This is the story of the silent language of Appalachia, the codes and signals that let mountain people speak across miles of forest, across generations of mistrust, and across the kind of silence that settles over these hills like morning fog. This is the story of how our people learned to make every ordinary thing, every quilt and broom and bird call, into a word in a language that outsiders would never comprehend. The mountains have always demanded their own kind of communication. You see, in the hollers, sound travels strange. A shout can echo off 3 ridges and come back to you twisted. A gunshot can bounce around so many hillsides you can't tell where it came from. And in those deep, narrow valleys where the sun only shines a few hours a day, where families lived miles apart connected only by footpaths and deer trails, you couldn't always rely on your voice to carry a message. But more than that, there were things that needed saying that couldn't be said out loud. When the revenuers came looking for stills during Prohibition, you couldn't exactly holler across the ridge. They're coming up the North Trail. When a family was sheltering someone running from the law or from worse, you couldn't hang a sign on your door. When a woman was in labor and needed the granny woman to come quick, you couldn't always spare someone to run the message, especially in winter, especially at night. So the mountain people did what they'd always done. They adapted. They took the ordinary things of daily life and turned them into a vocabulary. They made a language out of fabric and wood and sound, a language that looked like nothing at all to those who didn't know how to read it. Let's start with the quilts, because every mountain home had quilts, and every porch had a rail where those quilts could hang. You have to understand, quilting wasn't just women's work up here, it was survival. It was art. It was history stitched into fabric, patterns passed down from grandmothers who learned them from their grandmothers, some of those patterns coming all the way across the ocean from the old country. Every quilt told a story in its colors and its shapes, but some quilts, some specific patterns hung in specific ways, told stories that could save your life. The log cabin pattern was common enough. You'd see it on every 3rd porch in the holler. Blocks of fabric arranged in strips around a central square, light on one side, dark on the other, the whole thing looking like the walls of a cabin when you stacked the logs. Most times that center square was red like the hearth fire, the heart of the home. But sometimes that center square was black. Now, to most folks, a black center square didn't mean much. Maybe the quilter ran out of red fabric. Maybe they just liked how it looked. But to those who knew, a log cabin quilt with a black center square hanging on a porch rail meant something specific. It meant refuge. It meant safe house. It meant that if you were running, if you needed to disappear for a while, if the law or worse was on your trail, that house would take you in, no questions asked. The way the quilt hung mattered too. Draped over the porch rail with the black square facing the road meant the coast was clear. Come on in. Folded over with the black square hidden meant, wait, not now, there's trouble nearby. And if that quilt disappeared from the rail altogether in the middle of the day when the weather was fine, that was the loudest signal of all. That meant the revenuers were in the holler. That strangers were asking questions that everyone needed to make themselves scarce, and their stills even scarcer. Some families used different patterns for different messages. A drunkard's path quilt meant the route to the still was clear. A bear's paw meant danger on the mountain. A flying geese pattern pointed the way, the triangular geese always flying toward safety, toward the next safe house, toward the way out of the holler. The women who hung these quilts, they were the keepers of the code. They'd be out on their porches in the morning, shaking out bedding, airing out quilts, just doing their ordinary housework. But they were also reading the porches up and down the holler, checking the messages their neighbors had hung out, passing along warnings with nothing more than a change of fabric on a wooden rail. And if you were a revenuer walking up that dirt road, you'd just see mountain women doing their chores. You'd never know that by the time you reached the top of the holler, every still for 3 miles had been moved, every jar of moonshine had been buried, and every piece of copper tubing had been hidden where you'd never find it. Now, the broom. The broom is older than the quilt codes, older maybe than these mountains themselves. Every culture that ever swept a floor developed their own superstitions about brooms, their own rules about how and where a broom should rest. But in Appalachia, the broom became something more than superstition. It became a signal, a warning, a way to speak without words about the state of a household. They called it the Gatekeeper's broom, and its position told you everything you needed to know about whether you should knock on that door. A broom standing upright beside the door bristles down. That was normal. That was neutral. That just meant folks were home and going about their business. But a broom laid across the threshold, that was different. That was a line you didn't cross. Most times, a broom across the threshold meant sickness in the house. Could be the influenza that swept through these mountains every few years, killing whole families. Could be the scarlet fever that took so many children. Could be the consumption that ate people from the inside out that made them cough up their lungs bit by bit. Could be smallpox. Could be typhoid. Could be any of the 100 diseases that flourished in these isolated communities where one sick person could infect everyone before anyone knew what was happening. That broom was a warning and a kindness both. It said, stay back, don't bring your children here, don't risk your family. But it also said, we need help. Someone needed to leave food on the porch. Someone needed to fetch the doctor from town, if they had money for a doctor. Someone needed to tell the granny woman to bring her herbs and her knowledge and her steady hands. But the broom could mean other things too, darker things that folks didn't talk about directly. A broom laid across the threshold with the bristles facing out meant the family was in mourning. Someone had died, and the household was not receiving visitors except for those coming to help prepare the body or dig the grave. The bristles facing out swept away death, swept away bad spirits, kept grief contained within those 4 walls. A broom standing upright but placed directly in front of the door, blocking it. That meant trouble of a different sort. That meant a woman had left her husband, or a husband had turned violent, or there was a family dispute so serious that even neighbors, even kin, should stay away until things settled down. That broom was a barrier, a line drawn, a declaration that this was family business and family business alone. And sometimes, though this was rarer, a broom bristles up meant celebration. A wedding was coming. A baby had been born healthy. Someone had returned home safe from war or from the mines or from whatever danger had taken them away. Bristles up, swept good fortune into the house, invited it in, welcomed it to stay. The old folks, they could read a porch, like you might read a newspaper. They'd walk up a path and see the broom and the quilt and know immediately what kind of household this was, what kind of day they were having, whether they should knock or keep walking or come back with a basket of food and a jar of honey for the sick. But the signals that traveled the farthest, the ones that could carry a message from ridge to ridge, those were the sounds. The bird calls that weren't birds, the bells that rang when there was no church and no school, the echoes that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. You have to understand how sound works in the mountains. These hollers, they're like speaking tubes, like the curved horns people used before telephones. A sound made at one end can travel for miles, bouncing off rock faces following the curve of the valley. arriving at the other end almost as clear as when it started. The old-timers, they knew this. They knew exactly which ridges would carry an echo, which hollows would amplify a sound, which rocky outcrops would throw a noise back at you 3 or 4 times before it finally died away. And they knew how to use it. The hoot owl was the most common signal, the barred owl specifically, with its distinctive call that sounds like it's asking who cooks for you, who cooks for you all. Every mountain boy learned to mimic that call by the time he was 10 years old. They'd practice it walking to school, practice it doing chores, practice it until they could make a sound so perfect that real owls would answer them. But the Hoot Owl Signal wasn't just one call. It was a whole conversation, a whole vocabulary of hoots and pauses and patterns. One long hoot meant attention. Something's coming. Listen up. 2 short hoots meant all clear. Coast is clear. Proceed as planned. 3 hoots in quick succession meant danger. Law enforcement. Hide the still. 4 hoots meant gathering. Meet at the usual place. We need to talk. And the timing mattered as much as the pattern. An owl call in the middle of the night, that was natural enough. That was just owls being owls. But an owl call at noon, an owl call at sunset when the birds were settling down. That was a signal, and everyone within earshot knew it. The men running the stills, they had their own elaborate system. One man would be posted on the ridge above the still, watching the trails. If he saw revenuewards coming, he'd give the hoot owl signal, and within minutes that message would travel ridge to ridge, man to man. Until it reached the still itself, by the time the law arrived, there'd be nothing but cold ashes and empty woods. But it wasn't just about moonshine. Women used the hoot owl call too, especially the midwives and the granny women. When a woman went into labor, especially if it was a difficult birth or a first baby or twins, someone would step out onto the porch and give the signal. That call would travel to the next house and the next until it reached the granny woman's cabin. She'd know immediately what it meant. And she'd gather her bag of herbs and clean cloths and her birthing knowledge passed down through generations, and she'd head toward the source of that call. Sometimes the granny woman would answer back with her own owl call, signaling that she'd heard and she was coming, and that return call was a comfort to the laboring woman and her family, knowing that help was on the way, that they weren't alone in their fear and their pain and their hope. The bells were different. The bells were for emergencies that needed more than secrecy, that needed everyone to know right now. Most hollers had a bell somewhere, hanging from a tree or a post, big enough to be heard for miles. It might be an old farm bell, might be a church bell salvaged from a building that burned down, might be a ship's bell that somehow found its way into these landlocked mountains. Whatever it was, everyone knew what it meant when it rang. The pattern told the story. Steady, rhythmic ringing meant fire. Someone's house was burning. Everyone come help form a bucket line. Bring water, bring blankets, bring prayers. Rapid, frantic ringing meant injury or emergency. Someone fell in the mine. Someone got crushed by a tree. Someone needs help now. Slow, solemn ringing. One strike every few seconds. That meant death. Someone had passed, and the community needed to gather, needed to mourn, needed to help the family through what came next. But there were coded bell patterns too, secret ones that only certain people understood. 3 rings, pause. 2 rings, pause. 1 ring might mean the still is running tonight. Stay away from the North Ridge. 5 rings in quick succession might mean strangers in the holler. Unknown vehicles on the road. Everyone, be careful what you say. The children learned these codes without being taught directly. They learned them the way you learn a lullaby, the way you learn the smell of rain coming. They'd hear the bells, hear the owl calls, see the quilts change on the porches, and their minds would make connections. They'd watch their parents react to these signals, watch the adults exchange glances and nods, and make decisions based on information that seemed to come from nowhere. And when those children grew up, they'd use the same signals, teach them to their own children, keep the language alive even as the reasons for it changed. Because that's the thing about these signals, these codes, this silent language of the mountains. They were born out of necessity, out of survival, out of the need to protect each other from the law and from sickness and from all the dangers that filled these hollers. But they became something more than that. They became tradition. They became identity. They became a way of saying, we are mountain people. We take care of our own. We speak a language that outsiders will never understand. Even when prohibition ended and the revenuers stopped coming, people still used the quilt codes. Even when telephones arrived and you could call for the doctor instead of signaling with a broom, people still respected the gatekeeper's broom. Even when cell phones made it possible to text someone 3 ridges over, old-timers still listened for the hoot owl that didn't quite sound right. But now, things are changing faster than they ever have before. The young people, they're leaving for jobs in the cities, for colleges, for lives that don't involve reading quilts and listening for echoes. The old folks who remember all the patterns, all the signals, all the meanings, they're dying off, taking their knowledge with them. You can still see quilts hanging on porches in the hollers, but most of them now are just quilts, just fabric, just decoration. The log cabin pattern with the black center square, most folks hanging it today don't know what it used to mean. Don't know that their grandmother was speaking a whole language with that simple choice of color. The brooms still get left on porches, but they're plastic now, bright yellow and blue. Not the hand-tied brooms made from broomcorn and hickory. And they fall where they fall. No meaning, no message, just a cleaning tool left outside. The hoot owls still call in the night, and they're just owls now. The bells still ring, but only for church on Sunday, only for the volunteer fire department. The codes are fading, the signals are disappearing, the silent language is going quiet. And maybe that's natural. Maybe that's just the way of things. The world changes and the old ways fade. And new generations find new ways to communicate, new ways to survive, new ways to protect each other. But something is being lost, something important, because these signals, they weren't just practical. They were beautiful. They were art disguised as everyday life. They were poetry written in fabric and wood and sound. They were a testament to human ingenuity, to the way people can create entire languages out of necessity and pass them down through generations like heirlooms. And they were a reminder that Appalachian people, mountain people, we were never as isolated or as simple as outsiders thought we were. We had our own sophisticated systems of communication, our own networks of information, our own ways of building community and protecting each other. We didn't need the government's telegraph or telephone to talk across distance. We had quilts and brooms and bird calls that served us just fine. So maybe it's worth remembering these signals, even if we don't need them anymore. Maybe it's worth teaching the young ones what a log cabin quilt with a black center square used to mean. Maybe it's worth explaining why the old folks still pause when they hear a hoot owl in the middle of the day. Maybe it's worth keeping the language alive, even if it's just as history, just as a reminder of where we came from. Because in the holler, there are 3 ways to speak without making a sound. You watch the way a quilt hangs, you look at the angle of a broom, and you listen for the bird that doesn't belong in the trees. And if you know how to read those signs, if you know how to speak that silent language, then you're never truly alone in these mountains. You're connected to every person who ever hung a quilt as a warning, every person who ever laid a broom across a threshold, every person who ever stood on a ridge and hooted like an owl, to tell someone miles away that help was coming or danger was near or all was well. That's the secret of the holler. That's the language that lives in the silence. That's the code that runs deeper than words, older than memory, quiet as morning fog settling into the valley. And it's still there, if you know how to listen. Still there in the way an old woman shakes out her quilts on a Tuesday morning. Still there in the way a broom rests against a doorframe. Still there in the echo that bounces off the ridges when the night is still and the mountains are listening. Thank you for watching Legends from the Holler. If you are enjoying learning the old ways, consider subscribing to the channel. Do you have things you have learned from your family? Please tell me in the comments below. I am always excited to learn more because the holler remembers even when we forget. The mountains remember, even when we move away. And somewhere in these hills, someone still speaks the old language. Someone still reads the old signs. Someone still keeps the silence alive with messages that don't need words. All you have to do is watch and listen and remember.